There was a time when the world around was not inert. Every spring or bend in the river had a presence. Every grove or forest glade a watcher. Every mountain was a world of its own, full of history, meaning and memory. The ancient Greeks knew this well, and did not walk through empty landscapes. They walked through a world that noticed them. Before the great temples, and before the hierarchies of Olympus became fixed in marble and poetry, and before philosophy tried to organize the divine into categories, there was something much closer and more intimate, something embedded in the earth itself, the nymphs. Not gods or goddesses in the sense we might be used to, ones that are distant, enthroned, demanding tribute from their followers. The nymphs were spirits of place, bound to specific groves, particular rivers, and individual mountains. Wherever you stood in nature, the nymphs were not watching from above. They were present in the water, the earth, the very life itself that surrounded you. This is difficult to reconstruct cleanly. The traditions evolved across many centuries and across many regions. These realities layered over each other and sometimes contradicted. Given the nature of the nymphs and many pre-Christian and pagan belief systems, in many ways it is very fitting. It is kind of the point that there is no single authoritative account. What we have are fragments, hymns, genealogies, rural shrines, passing references in epic poetry. But within these, there is a consistent pattern. The ancient Greeks experienced the natural world as inhabited, not metaphorically or as romantic poetic decoration. The spring was alive because a spirit lived there. The tree was sacred because a presence was bound to it. When that tree died, so did she. This is not symbolism. This is a worldview where the boundary between spirit and matter was thinner than we assume. Or perhaps, like many other worldviews, that boundary never even existed at all. The nymphs were female spirits of nature, long-lived, but not immortal in the way that the Olympians were. They occupied an intermediate category of being. They could endure for centuries, even millennia, but they were not untouchable by time. Their existence was contingent. It was bound to place and to elements, to the lifespans of the thing they inhabited. This distinction mattered in Greek thought because divinity was not a single tier, it had gradients. Zeus does not age, Athena cannot die. The 12 Olympians exist outside time, untouchable and eternal. The nymphs did not. Hesiod's theogony places them among the early generations of divine beings, daughters of the primordial waters, spirits of mountains and rivers. The Oceanids were born from the very earliest primordial waters that encircled the world, specifically from the titans Oceanus and Tethys, created as part of the very first ordering of the cosmos. The Oceanids here are raw. They are primal and elemental, older than many Olympians. But the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite is more specific. It describes nymphs, particularly the Hamadryads, as specifically bound to trees, born when the tree is born, growing as it grows, and dying when the tree dies. Again, this is not metaphor, this is ontology, a statement about what is believed to be real. In this context, the Hamadryad's life is the tree's life. Her existence is not separate from the oak or the ash she inhabits. She is not a goddess who chooses to live in a forest. She is the forest, given presence and given form. The categories of nymph were specific. Naiads inhabited freshwater, springs, rivers and streams, and some were known by name. Kaleoi, or beautiful flowing, appears in multiple myths as the river nymph, daughter Okeloas, showing that she, like many others, was not a generic spirit. She was not only tied to fresh water, she also had lineage, a story, and children. The Greeks saw individuals within the greater whole. Dryads were tree spirits more broadly. Oreads belonged to the mountains. The aforementioned Oceanids were not merely sea spirits, but due to their direct Titan heritage, they were embodiments of the life-giving currents that flowed and shaped the early cosmos. By contrast, the Naiads, daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea, another pre-Olympian ancient god, were more specifically tied to the Mediterranean Sea, coastal presences, companions of sailors and witnesses to storms. So each type corresponded to an often quite specific feature of the natural world. And there were many, many of them. Not 12. Not a manageable pantheon, but thousands. And importantly, they were local and tangible, not distant and abstract. And they mattered to the people who lived near them. The nymph of your valley was not the nymph of the next valley over. And so there was a depth and a reciprocity in the relationship between human and spirit. Geography was not an empty space between cities and place. The nymphs and the landscapes were specific and inhabited, and they were sacred. In many ways, these spirits were more relatable and easier to connect with because they felt closer to us. They were born, and they lived also, and they could die like us. Modern scholarship calls them minor deities. The classification makes sense within a hierarchy. Olympians at the top, nymphs somewhere below, mortals at the bottom. But the framework may miss what mattered. In rural Greece, the spring at the edge of your village was anything but minor. In fact, it was everything. Without it, there was no water, and you would die. Therefore, the nymph who lived there was not a lesser goddess. She was the one you prayed to when the well ran dry. She was closer than Olympus, more immediate than Zeus, and therefore, in many ways more powerful in terms of direct communion with the divine. Pausanias, travelling through Greece in the 2nd century, recorded what he saw: shrines to nymphs. He describes caves in Arcadia dedicated to them, sacred caves where offerings were left, simple places of acknowledgement and gentle worship, even down to stones purposefully arranged to mark where a presence was felt. These were not poetic inventions. They were sites Pausanias physically visited and documented. Not grand sites and ostentatious offerings of state religion. They were local and intimate. The religion of farmers, shepherds and travellers, people who needed the spring to flow, the hunt to succeed, the path through the mountains to stay safe. And so nymphs represented a different kind of divinity. Not power projected from above, but presence embedded in place. Not grand cosmic order, but the specific sacredness. This tree, this water, this rock. Hierarchy implies distance. The nymphs were not distant, they were present. The question is not whether they ranked below the Olympians. The question, and maybe the point, is whether they represent something older than the ranking itself. Despite all of this, it is also important to explore how they behave, because nymphs are not necessarily gentle. They could bless, but they could also unsettle. Ancient sources warn of those who encountered nymphs improperly, who stumbled into sacred spaces without reverence, or who lingered too long in solitude. The experience was not always tender. It could easily overwhelm, disorientate, even unravel and unmake an individual person. The Greeks had a word, Nympholepsy, possession by nymphs. A madness that seized certain people, poets, wanderers, those who spent too much time alone in wild places. It was not a metaphorical frenzy. It was recognized as a specific condition, divine madness attributed to proximity to nymphs, ecstatic inspiration that could overwhelm the rational mind. They were aligned with forces that civilizations tried to manage but could not fully control. They were known to attract mortals, sometimes to inspire, sometimes to entangle. Stories survive of shepherds drawn into unions with nymphs, producing children who stood liminally between these worlds. The boundary between human and divine here was porous, and contact was rarely neutral. The company they kept enforces this association with expressions of the wild and liminal further. Pan, the god of shepherds and wild places, was often their companion. Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and dissolution, moved among them, and in his later forms as Bacchus too. This relationship between nymphs, satyrs, fauns, ecstatic, intoxicated followers, both human and beast, those far outside of order and civilization, is seen time and time again. We have discussed Pan, Dionysus and Bacchus in previous videos, if you wish to dive deeper into those. But Dionysus, the god who dissolved identity and who removed all boundaries, was in some traditions raised in secret by the nymphs of Mount Nysa, nursing him, protecting him from Hera's wrath, as he was yet another child of Zeus born outside their marriage. Here, and many times, we see nymphs were not incidental figures in the mythic world. They were caretakers of the gods, active participants in the shaping of divine narratives, and their intimacy with Dionysus explains their proximity to ecstasy, frenzy, and sacred intoxication. The nymphs were part of that world, the world outside the city walls, outside law, outside the structures that made social life predictable, comfortable, and controllable. This concept, blurred boundaries, fluid or lost identity, is present repeatedly in Ovid's Metamorphosis. Nymphs did not stay in stable forms. Daphne, fleeing Apollo, becomes a laurel tree. The nymph Echo, cursed, loses her body entirely and is reduced to voice alone, repeating only what others say, and fading lost into the rocks. The story of Arethusa reinforces this instability. This nymph was pursued by the river god Alpheus. She fled across the land until she was transformed into a spring in Sicily, her body dissolving into water, her identity merging with the landscape itself. Even in transformation, she did not vanish, she became place, a fountain that still bore her name. The boundary between nymph and geography, between spirit and the real, tangible world, was always fluid. These are myths about the instability of boundaries, human and divine, body and landscape, self and place, between order and chaos, the wild self and the ordered self. And the nymphs, those who existed at those edges, in those transitional liminal spaces, represented a form that was fluid. A woman becomes a tree, a voice becomes stone, presence dissolves into the things it inhabits. Through this, the concept that Dionysus and his followers embody is deepened. The idea that nothing is truly separate, that everything in the cosmos is united by universal threads. Nothing is destroyed, it simply changes form, it transmutes. This is why the nymphs were not domesticated into Olympian order. They could not be. They represented what resists organization, the wild sacred, the unpredictable presence, the force that inspires and unsettles in equal measure. You could honor them, and you could leave offerings, but you could not control them. They were not servants of civilization. They were what civilization encountered when it left the walls, when it entered the forest, and when it knelt at the spring and felt something older looking back. Not hostile, but also not safe, but certainly present. They were described as laughing in groves, dancing in circles unseen by human eyes, vanishing at the edge of perception. To encounter them was to feel that the world was not inert. This was animism, The world was alive in ways that did not answer to human expectation. There is a recurring story, one you will recognise if you have watched recent videos. Not immediately, not everywhere at once, but over centuries the framework shifted. As urban religion hardened into doctrine, and later monotheism required a single, transcendent source of divinity, local spirits no longer fit. Sacred springs became superstition. Groves were cleared without ceremony, and caves where offerings were left fell silent. The land was no longer sacred. This was not always violent suppression. Often it was reinterpretation, absorption, reclassification. What had once been presence became folklore and rural belief, old wives' tales. The nymphs were not denied, they were diminished into nothing much more than woodland fairies. A worldview that once allowed ambiguity in grey areas, gradients of being, blurred lines, as well as direct communion with the divine, and with that self-empowerment, was slowly replaced by one that demanded absolutes. Eternal, all-powerful God, or inert matter. There was no space left for something in between. And so the nymphs were not destroyed, they were recategorized, rendered unreal by a structure of thought that could no longer recognize what they had been. But the question remains, did the nymphs disappear because they were never real? Or did perception change? And with it, the capacity to encounter what they represented. After all, the springs still flow and bring life. The groves that were not cut down still stand. The mountains remain, their roots as old and deep as ever. Nothing out there has actually changed. Whether anything inhabits them now is not a question of fact. It is a question of what you are prepared to notice. The Greeks walked through a world that watched them. We walk through a world we have been taught not to see watching back. Perhaps that is the only difference.